Welcome to In the SALOON with. I'm Jane Messer. Margo, Paul, it is so good to have you in the studio together with me. Thank you for coming in. So we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into last week's amazing performance and reading of your short story, Singing My Sister Down. So was this the first time, Margo, that you'd heard the story read in a live situation like that?
Yes, it was. Yeah, I was a bit worried beforehand. I didn't know whether I'd be able to hold it together because I know I've had times when I've thought, I can handle this. I'm in front of a class and I'm teaching something about characterisation or something, and I've tried to just, read the first bit so there's a few characters there so you can hear them talking in their distinctive voices, and I've got, a few paragraphs in, and because I know what's coming, I've got to pieces in front of my class. So I was wondering if Paul would make it through, and I was wondering if I would make it through.
So you're saying when you've been teaching and reading the story, you've felt tearful. Yeah.
Yeah, I have actually. Have I got to the end? I have got to the end once, yeah. And we all went to pieces, class and teacher, yeah.
Wow, okay. And, I mean, the audience were riveted when Paul was reading the story, and we will talk about the reading in a little bit. You mentioned later that you heard somebody crying behind you.
Yeah, there were some little sobs coming from over my shoulder.
Yeah, I believe it, which, I mean, hopefully listeners have listened to the story before hearing this, but anyone listening to this episode before hearing Singing My Sister Down read by Paul Capsis, please do listen. You might not cry.
You might not. You might not.
You might laugh.
You might. You'd be very surprised.
No.
I think if you laugh, you're a sociopath.
Well,
So this is a story that I have also used in my teaching, and from the moment I conceived StorySALOON as a thing, I knew that I wanted Singing My Sister Down to be one of the stories that we included, even though it is quite a long story for a live reading, and it's so powerful, and it does take the listener or the reader to dark places. And yet also there's so much hope and beauty in this story. It's a coming-of-age story, you could say, where the narrator goes through some really dark experiences, losing his sister and singing his sister down. But he also grows and discovers new aspects of himself, and it's really a story where it's important to his maturation. But we're actually I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, because what I wanted to do is go back to what was your response to Paul's reading of it, because he must have brought a voice to it that in your silent reading of the story or your own reading aloud of your own story, you would never have imagined that particular voice for the story.
Probably not, no. Yeah, I suppose I thought he did a really good job of, because it's a child's voice, of being a child without being a very self-consciously a child. So capturing the childness of the voice without it being a childish.
And yet, because when we rehearsed it, we were talking about that, weren't we, Paul? And my way of thinking about it was that it was the child's voice, but it was the voice coming from later. Yes. Did you find that helpful, thinking about it like that, Paul? That he's older now, but he's revisiting the past.
that's right. And trying to recall, or in a sense channel the voices of Ik and the mother, and recalling. I guess the difficulty was because there was other children, Feli and Dash, that I was trying to distinguish their voices as well. And Auntie May and Mama, that they were challenges.
Because of the dialogue. So it's narrated by the young brother, but then he's also conveying the voices
of two other children.
The mother, Icky, people on
even the
bank.
chief. That's right. Oh, yes, that's right. And those characters too.
I set up a good job for you to take care of.
Oh, my. I was saying the pressure, my goodness. It was incredibly pressure. I felt so nervous doing it, preparing for it, reading it. I felt a pressure doing the voices of the children, trying to find different voices. I was trying to find, so there's Ick's voice, which I was trying to get, also not just the voice, it was trying to get into the emotion of her and what was going on for her, how she was dealing with her situation. To me, this was extraordinary, the challenge of that. And then there's Felly and there's Dash, the different voices of those children, the mother, Auntie May, the differences between them, perhaps not so different, and then the voice of the narrator as an older person, trying to find, allowing it to sit more in my own voice, but also in a deeper way, I guess, to show some sort of maturity or growth.
I think that's where the difference between the story on the page and the story being performed comes out, because I think when you're just reading the story on the page, I've never been aware of the idea that this narrator has gotten older. But in the performance, when we were talking about how to read it, that seemed to become quite important. Otherwise, Paul would have had to imitate almost a young boy's voice and level of maturation at that point in time, which would have created quite a different sound.
Yeah, I think it would have been quite a strain to maintain that but also it's hard to say, because it is a story of this child realising things, and we realise a lot of these things before he actually does. So there's kind of you're cueing us into things that he doesn't really understand yet, just by saying what's happening around him. It's a bit of a complex situation. So I think that the maturity of the voice kind of suits that situation, because it's his wisdom arriving, his realisation that things are not all that well with his society, and that the seeds of rebellion are kind of being sown in this scene without him even really making that connection yet.
And I found, just to focus a little bit on the story, I found it really interesting the way that you sometimes use minor characters to reveal his change, so that, for instance, when he goes to get Auntie May, or Auntie May. Is it Auntie May?
I said
Auntie May.
May.
Yeah.
May or May.
Probably May.
No, I think you called her May. Auntie May, spelled M-A-I. When he goes to get her from the bank, from where everybody's waiting, and she doesn't want to come out onto the tar, and other people notice how he's become so determined. So using their voices to reflect on him, that was a really interesting little technique that you used. But just to get back to the heart of the story, I mean, where did this story come from, Margo?
That's a great question, Jane.
Well, whenever I say this, I always feel very sort of cold-hearted. I thought it came from an episode of a show called Global Village that used to be on at the turn of the century. And it was an episode, it was about those tar pits. And I think they were in an ex-French colony in northern Africa, I think. And they were not quite like the La Brea tar pits, which are, they're kind of sloppy. You know, there's a lot of water and mess on the top. These were very kind of dry and cushiony, and they looked like quite fun to actually walk around. And they showed people walking around, and they had all these stories about people who'd, you know, driven home drunk and parked their truck on the tar without realising it, and then they'd come out and found it half sunk the next day. And I just noted down the idea that if you've got these things in your village, at some point they're going to be used. If they get rid of things that are not meant to be got rid of, they're going to get rid of the people that they don't particularly want to be part of their village anymore. And so I wanted to show the experience of that being done. And I don't know where the boy came from, but I suppose because I was going to reveal it to the reader and I had to reveal it to someone as well. I couldn't be someone who was very practiced and knew how things went and accepted that behaviour, because it was such an outlandish thing for people to do. But we do it all the time. I didn't want it to be particularly an African village or an African people or a French people. I didn't want it to be an identifiable people or an identifiable place. I wanted nobody to be let off lightly. You couldn't say, oh, this is what they would have done in the past. So I put in a few details that made it more modern, and I didn't want it to be a particular place so that people could say, oh, they just do that over there.
I think you succeeded with that so very well. I mean, that's where I guess that sort of slight element of fantasy helps, that you can tell it's very much based on people that we know, societies that we know, characters that we know, and the sense of place of there being mountains and an embankment with grass and some of it with mud and all of those, and having a community that has a system of punishment. We recognise all of that. And then depending on what your knowledge of history is, I mean, there were moments, where everybody's watching, where you think of, the Christians being murdered in the Colosseum and animal fights and gladiators and so on. It brings up all sorts of...
Even in modern times, there's these horrid videos of, executions in countries, and the people watch, and they happen now. And sometimes these dreadful videos get leaked. So they do happen now as well.
Yeah, they do. Absolutely. And the boy, he really finds it horrifying, the way that people come and watch, and it's a form of entertainment. But it's also, I feel like we're probably concentrating too much on that aspect of the story. But the family, it's such an interesting family that you created there. The mother, Icky's backstory, which is never fully explained, but we can imagine. So what were your thoughts about the family, if you can go back that far to the writing?
Well, she needed to have done something very serious. And I think I'm not quite sure why I chose that particular crime for her, but it also had to be something where she was at odds with her family, or she was at odds with her society, she was at odds with he was going to end up at odds with the society that he found himself in. And she was there for part of it. She was there for being covered in all the glorious wedding glitter and gowns and whatnot, but she wasn't there for the actual patriarchal system that she was going to be entering into and becoming a servant of once she was married, was the implication.
Yeah. So StorySALOON, short stories centre stage, we celebrate the short story, and you have written so many short stories, amazing short stories. What draws you to the short story form, and what's special? I mean, feel free to run with it.
Well, I first started writing short stories because I had decided I was going to specialise in fantasy stories, and I'd written a fantasy novel which I just made too huge, too big. I created this enormous, complicated world, and I ended up not being able to drive a narrative through it. And so I shifted over to short stories simply because they were short, and simply because I could keep everything in my head at once. I could upload the whole story in my head, and I could know if I moved this tiny thing over here, then these three things over here needed to move as well. Whereas with a novel, it was just getting out of control. And then I think I just fell in love with the way that you can just imply, a whole chunk of history or a whole chunk of personality in just a glance past person, or just a sort of offhand reference that somebody can have. You can say, okay, they talk about, the milk wars, and all of a sudden there's that chunk of history that nobody can understand. Nobody knows what it's about. They can only imagine from what the water wars are going to be like, that, the milk wars might be something weirdly like that, and stuff like that. I think just the economy of it and the ease of handling. Yeah.
But that can't explain it all, because you've then gone on to write novels, yet you still also write short stories.
Yeah, it's for the same reason. Often it's because there are just two tiny things that when you bang them together, they suggest a weird little narrative. You can't really embroider much further than the sort of shock of that combination, but the shock itself and, the immediate effects of it are exciting and interesting to play with. So it's just a sort of a short game, whereas the novel is the long game and the long hard road.
For the writer, one of the great things about the short story is that obviously sometimes if you're writing a number of them, you might come back to the drafts month after month, or even, put it down and write a novel and then come back to the draft. But you can finish a short story in a couple of months.
You can, or a couple of days. Or even
a couple of days, depending.
Yeah, Seeing My Sister Down was very fast. That was just one of the occasional one where you sit down and you've been sort of carrying around this idea or this combination of ideas in your head for, a little while, and you chew over it and you sit down and tend to write it up to just before the climactic scene. And then the next day come back and finish off the climactic scene in that conclusion. And that was pretty much how Black Juice happened. It was really quick. It was just like it fell out. And I've got the first draft with, a few little twitches and fiddles on it, preserved, but it's pretty much as it came out. It's kind of astounding when that happens. It doesn't happen often enough, I can tell you.
Yeah, listener beware, it does not happen often like that. Paul, performing. You have performed in so many different roles, some of them created by yourself, some of them for other theatre companies. How did you find your way at the beginning into the kinds of performances and roles that you needed and wanted to do?
Gosh, that's such a long journey of experimenting and experiencing before at least 10 years when I started out in community theatre and amateur musical society shows. I had jobs. It was a hobby, and then I wanted to do it. And that's when it got difficult, because then I realised how hard it is to break into the professional world of performing. I was always interested in singers mostly, and I was a teenager and our high school was involved in production at Nimrod, and we were asked to paint the murals as you're walking up to the old Nimrod. And I didn't understand theatre, so we got to see that particular production. It was the Oresteia. I was 14, Colin Friels, Anna Volska, all these great people, Chris McQuaid, all these Carol Burns, all these wonderful people. And I didn't understand it, but I was fascinated and excited by it. Also, when I was about 8 years old, my family took me to see Jim Sharman's production of Jesus Christ Superstar at the Capitol Theatre, which I only recently got to perform in. And difficult, because also I didn't train. Growing up, I had, Maltese and Greek in my family, so English was kind of not something that it was easy for me, which that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense. So the thing about reading aloud is also always been a challenge, especially first reads when we have to read the script around the table. I mean, I do have a tendency to hit words, as you will know, Jane, is because we had how many rehearsals? 5?
Not quite.
Singing My Sister Down.
Not quite that many.
I work better with a director. I work like you were the director and you were guiding me, because I'm not this person that just picks something up and can just do it. I have to work hard at it. And I think that's partially because I was never trained. But one thing is commitment. You just have to commit.
But actually, I'll interrupt there, because I have worked with other actors for StorySALOON where we really do go line by line and talk, not every line, but some of them, where we say, well, okay, what's going on here? What's the emotional turn here? There's a shift from this to this, the meaning or the feelings and so on. So, yeah, I think the way that we rehearsed was completely suitable to the complexity and the length of the story, rather than it being something that you needed extra help with, because I really don't think you did. I mean, there were different ways you could, like the voices of the other people or how the narrator's feeling from one moment to another.
But it's like nothing I've read before, Singing My Sister Down, Margo. It was a world that took me a while to understand the different feelings and events that were going on with each and every one of them, and the build-up, and then the discovery. Because I think when you read it on your own and you sit there with your thoughts and you're figuring out what is going on actually physically to Icky, and then through the eyes and memory of the narrator. I think also, I guess I sometimes get caught up in sentence structure. And I remember the thing that you sent, the very first story.
Yeah. And
it was written as a block. And then once I got it again, and it was
in paragraphs.
Right,
okay. Yeah, that
and then it just made it, for me, it bounced off the page. And then I saw, it's weird, I work in a weird sort of, as a performer, I work with image mostly. When I learn a script, I learn it through ideas and image. I have to learn the idea and then the image, because you can sit there for days learning by rote words. And I think that's a dangerous thing, because we are meant to tap into the emotion, and we are our role, our job as performers is to bring them to life. I think that was my main, what I was most nervous about, was that they were authentic and believable and real, even in this made-up world, but with so much in it that is relatable.
Yeah.
One of the things in the live performance that, I don't know, might be there just in the mood of your voice is that during the live performance, the expressiveness on your face and what you did with your hands, because you were sitting still on the stool, and because it's being recorded live for podcast, the actors are all directed to stay with the mic. There's no getting off the chair. There's no wandering around. Stay with the mic. And yet you did so much with your hands and your face and the pauses.
None of that was planned. That's what happened on the day for me. I did not expect I would be doing that, but it's something about, it's an anchoring, I call it. I do these things to anchor myself. I do it when I sing. Recently, I had to read Oscar Wilde De Profundis, and I had to sit there and read it as if he were reading it in the jail. I wasn't Oscar Wilde, though, so I had to interpret it as myself. The thing was, I had to sit. I wasn't able to do that, and I found that incredibly difficult, not to be able to
even move your hands.
Yeah, I had to read it. I also had to read it because the audience were above me, so I had to hold my head up and read. And I had a cellist and other things going on. But the pauses, I guess that was for me to give weight to what was being said. I didn't want to indulge in theatrical pause. It was just because I want to take in exactly what's going on. I want the audience to feel it. I want the audience to feel it.
Give
at the
them
risk
space
of,
for that.
Yeah, at the risk of, putting in silence. Because I think, as I've learned over the many years as a performer, silence is equally as important to not, if the writer says pause, it's different. If there is no pause, that's another thing altogether. I'm talking about a script.
Yes.
Like often scripts, there's a tendency for actors to create pauses when they are not there. Full stop, comma. The great Zoe Caldwell, the actress, in her book, she says a script is full stop, comma, if the writer puts a pause. So to read a story is a whole other thing. It's a different challenge.
And also because we've got the live audience who, many of whom we can assume have not read the story, and so you need more time for them to take
process
it in,
what
to
they're
process
hearing,
what it is. Which was partly why when I introduced the story, I thought I better let them know what a tar pit is, because when I first read the story, I thought it was something you'd made up. But then when I researched it, realised, no, they exist, and managed to actually see one for myself. But when we're listening to a story, there's just so much going on for the listener to try and process. And if you set off on the wrong interpretation, it can take a while to come back and go, oh, right, now that makes sense.
I thought it was a great thing that you did that you had mentioned those things. And I felt, because what I feel sometimes is when you go on stage and you start something, you really have to be ready, breathing. That's why I took a bit of time before I started. I didn't want to just throw, because sometimes when you do that, you can easily go off the rails with your breathing. Like my eyes, as I get older, my eyes play tricks. That's what I was most afraid of. That, my eyes go funny and...
Read a word that's not there.
I did that with the Oscar Wilde. Sorry, there are no refunds, 45 downstairs for those who might be listening, complaining.
I'm sure no one complained.
No, but I broke down doing the Oscar Wilde. So I was on the verge of that. That's the other thing about when you read a story. You could read it 100 times and it does not affect you. But when you read it aloud, when you put it out into the air, when you feel the emotions of the people, I felt like I could feel things from the audience, people relating to the mother. See, I even get emotional just saying the mother, the strength of that mother, the power of that mother and what she had to do. And then Auntie and the character, the narrator's anger about the people watching and look, okay, she's done something. There's a reason in this particular world, they're doing this to her. However, it's for me, my idea with her after the marriage, and the reason she does what she does is because I imagine abuse from him, the husband.
Yeah.
I imagine.
Yeah, I think in this village that the marriage contract involves subjugation of the women in some terrible way.
Yeah. And the mother and the family knowing that Icky's personality meant that there was possibility that she would do something. I mean, it's really
she's fiery.
Really
she's a fiery young woman or girl, and that's how I imagine that she ended up married to this guy. Maybe she really wanted to marry him.
She thought she might be able to.
She thought
work it out. It reminds me of my mother. See, that's why my mother married my father. I mean, she didn't want to marry him. You know, it was early 60s, and in Maltese culture, it was big shame. She had her first sexual experience and became pregnant. She did not love my father. She didn't like him. She had to marry him. And she, to the day she died, she said that he destroyed her life. She allowed that because, you know, as a young person, I used to say to her, Mum, it was so long ago. Why are you still angry? Even when my father died, she was still going on about it. I said, Mum, he's buried in the ground. But no. So I guess the emotion for her, for Icky, and the family realising her character, her personality.
Yeah. Your mother could have been Icky. She could have taken a different action and then would have had a very, very different path.
I always wanted my mother to do therapy or even in my early 20s, I used to say to her, Mum, I think you need to go and see a therapist because I just saw this incredible anger and limiting behaviour for her. My father, he was fine. He'd moved on, you know, and it was torture. And I'm still tortured by the fact that my mother allowed this thing to happen to her and allowed it to affect her life the way it did.
Yeah.
So she was like Icky in the tar. She didn't know how to get out.
Well, I mean, in the story there is no getting out, is there? If there's a struggle, if they were to attempt to refuse what the community had decided must happen, it would get worse. Margo, when you're writing, do you have the way that Paul's related his family and his mother's story to Mama in Singing My Sister Down? When you're writing characters, are you thinking of people that you know and lives that you've witnessed?
No, not for that story, not particularly. No, I was thinking more in a generalised sense of what happens to a lot of women and what has happened to a lot of women in the past, how marriage has treated them, how marriage has been a thing that the larger social organisation wants, but it's not necessarily conducive to individual women's growth and health and well-being. And
interestingly, in the story, the father, we don't know where Papa is.
I have no idea.
He could have died. He could have wandered off.
Done a runner
years ago.
Oh, yeah, well, I guess because there was the chief there. He was the big male figure there. We didn't need another one out there on the tar making those same, bluff, punishing remarks, doing those things. So I wanted, and also because the father wasn't there, it gave the mother more authority because she was presumably a widow or presumably the person who was in charge of the family while the father was away. So she was perfectly free in showing her reactions to what was, and in guiding the ceremony the way that she wanted it playing out.
Gosh, the line about we all looked at the chief, but Mama just walked out to her daughter.
That's right. She's a very majestic figure. She just takes over, moves it all along the way she wants it.
It's interesting because there are quite a few characters in the story, which sometimes can be a little hard to follow, but in this story, just not at all. Each of them is so distinctive. And even Dash, for instance, who doesn't play a big role, but you get such a strong sense of Dash being a bit disobedient, possibly a little bit like his older sister, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
And that the little boy Felly is a little bit more like the narrator, I guess.
Yeah, just a watcher and a wanderer.
What I love is when the narrator goes to get the wreath and sees Auntie May, and they have the discussion about, Auntie May, Icky wants to see you. She, and then other people comment. I love that one of them says, well, we've never heard from this person before. That's another thing. It's like, as you were saying before, as a maturity or as a growth, this person is now, the narrator is speaking up, and others around them are noticed and are making comment. This person always been quiet, and here they are. Okay, the sister is sinking into the tar, and this event is happening. I find that really interesting background. And also the stuff about music. I love the stuff about the writing of, these were the songs, the children's songs being sung, which I think that's incredibly powerful, the idea of music and singing.
That's what I think first made me think of asking you to be the story's narrator, was the title of the song. But because you've sung so much, even though there weren't songs in it, they were mentioned. And and that put you into my mind. And also just the emotion and having somebody who could, an actor who could hold all the ambiguity and then make it less ambiguous, I guess, and give it the right voice. I've just got a question for you, Margo, about, because Paul's just mentioned it, about the narrator's sort of growth and his transformation, and he does have that breakdown and needs to be carried by his mother later in the story. Is that something, we hear about it a lot in the how to write and teaching of writing and so on, that, the character has to have a journey and they have to have personal growth of some sort or other and have a realization or something like that. Is that something that you believe in or do think is important? Or
well, you have to have something that's pulling people through the story by the nose, and there was enough interest in just watching Icky go down. But the complicating factor and the interesting factor was you can't have a main character doing that. You can't have your main character extinguished. That very rarely works. So it has to be someone else realising the horrendousness of this practice and seeing it for the first time, because your readers are going to be seeing it for the first time. Well, not because, but it's one way of doing it. I think when you're in the middle of writing it and you're just following that the trajectory of those two people and all the other people around them, it doesn't feel as mechanical as that, like as when you're teaching a class in creative writing and saying this to them. You can it has a momentum of its own. You're looking very closely at it and you can feel the movement yourself. You're inserting yourself into that movement and letting it tell you what's going on. And then you get to a certain point where you realise, okay, this is the breaking point when everything closes up or everybody around is satisfied that this person is dead, and I suddenly realise, as the reader will realise, nobody is coming to save this girl. And then it all becomes too much. It becomes too much for the reader and it becomes too much for the narrator. And then it has to go into some kind of swimmy, uncertain, half-conscious state that he has to endure or, be submerged in and then wake up later. You have to have a break there because there's a break in him.
I thought it was interesting with that story that it doesn't end when her life is extinguished, that we then continue with his experience and his suffering and his sort of realisation of the finality of everything that's happened and the society he's with and his love for his mother and her strength and so on. Was that continuing from that point on, where I think many writers would have just ended the story when Icky went down. Was that something that just naturally, you just kept writing, or was that a conscious decision, this is not the end?
I don't think I ever thought that her disappearing was the end. But I didn't want him to, the way you describe it makes it sound as if he's actually making sense of it on the way out. But he's not, he doesn't really make sense of it. He's just saying, I had to be sort of half carried. I was not very competent to get myself out of that place. They all got me out of it, and I was confused all the way out. And I closed my eyes and pretended I was somewhere else. I basically dissociated from the whole thing. So it's so all those thoughts that you're enumerating, he's going to have those later. He's going to make sense of it later, and he's going to be more articulate about his rebellion later, probably. Yeah. Probably, if he doesn't just submit to the way that village works.
I mean, what's remarkable is this: we're having this really rich discussion about a short story, and which is why a good short story is so satisfying, because it holds a whole world of people and feelings and lives, and yet it can hold it in so few words. I think Singing My Sister Down, it's about 3,500 words or 3,700 words. It's just a few pages, and yet it encompasses, a whole world. Yeah. I'd like to find out now what are you working on with your writing, or are you taking a rest? Or
you could say I'm taking a rest. I should be working on a novel. I have a large stalled novel at the moment, which I'm walking around and throwing up my hands in despair about.
Oh, okay. I can't imagine you stalled. But so what's with the stalling? What's with the
I think it's life circumstances have stalled me at the moment. Family bereavements and various things have just in the last couple of years. It's been a very crowded couple of years. So it's part of it, very extended taking a breath before applying myself again.
Yeah.
Keeping an eye on it out of one eye, wondering if it'll come to anything.
Well, you have many readers who would love to see you back again with new work, and I'm sure that you will. You're the consummate writer and professional. And Paul, what's coming up for you in the next few months, or what are you working on now?
I have a performance for Vivid on Wednesday night.
Oh, wonderful.
And then I don't have anything until September. At the very end of August, I start rehearsal for something at the Sydney Theatre Company. I don't think it's been announced that I'm involved. However, the production has been advertised. So there's a big gap.
Oh, right. So are we breaking news here on the StorySALOON podcast?
We are.
That Paul is coming up at Sydney Theatre Company later in the year?
We're not meant to mention it. But
do you want me to?
I don't know. I don't know if I'm allowed or not, but I mean, I'm doing it. I've said yes. And in the meantime, I'm going overseas for the first time to Paris. I'm nervous. I haven't travelled for a long time. A lot of the reason why I haven't travelled is my mum, her health was declining, and I was her principal carer. So I really never could travel really for very long. And that just got worse. And also, all my life, my mother was terrified of my travelling. She would go through a lot of difficulty with me travelling. Mm-hmm. So this would be the first time I've ever travelled without my mother's intense worry and fear. Mm-hmm. So this is a new thing for me. I know at 61 this is an odd thing, but
I know when you said the other day that you hadn't been to Paris before, I just assumed that with your performances and your interest in theatre and so on, that you would be very familiar with Paris. And I'm sorry that your mother passed away last year.
Thank you. Well, I've always been absolutely fascinated by Paris. A lot of it has to do with the artists,
of course,
that have come from my heroes, so many of them, Edith Piaf, Charles Aznavour, Jacques Brel, the culture, the language, just so much, and the wonderful history in film, particularly for me. So I got to the stage where I thought, oh, well, I don't think I'm ever going to get there. And then a dear close friend of mine a couple of months ago said, look, your mum's gone now and I think you have no more excuses. I know, she's a very good friend. She's very sharp, shoots from the hip. And then also not having work for 3 months.
Yeah, having a break.
Having a break. And also my mother's passing has changed me. I'm not really fully aware yet to the extent. I'm not sure who I am without my mother.
I know the feeling. Mm-hmm.
Everything revolved around my mother. And before her, it was my grandmother, Angela. So, I held back. I was one of these people who wanted to live overseas and be a performer elsewhere because I always felt Australia was very limited in the way we see, casting and who gets to be in the big spotlight and all that kind of stuff. And I think it still is. However, I don't regret that I didn't abandon my grandmother or my mother. And I never will.
No. I'm glad, though, that you do now have that opportunity, and I hope, someday Europe is going to discover you and you're going to take Paris by storm.
I don't know if I'll ever. I can sing one song in French and I can't really speak the language, but there are so many places I want to go to, and performing-wise, you get to an age and you just, I'm just really, to be really honest, I'm very happy that I stayed here and made work and managed to be a performer here. Because it's very difficult in Australia if you don't tick the boxes, if you're not heterosexual, if you're not Anglo-Saxon, if you're not, masculine, all the things I'm not, but I managed to make a career.
You did manage to make a career, and you've had a sustained impact by staying here. That now that you're saying that you weren't willing to leave, I'm so glad you did stay.
Thank you.
Because if everybody,
I could have
became an expatriate artist, our culture would just be so empty, and we needed different queer, all sorts of voices, performers. I think for perhaps younger audiences or younger performers, they probably don't realise how narrow the range was of what we were seeing and who could perform and who got parts.
No,
things that we take for granted now, that we see people of different ethnicities on television or in the theatre. Even as little ago as 10 or 15 years ago.
That's right.
Was very strange.
Yeah, it was just the way it was, culture. However, I do see the change, and I think wonderful for the young people now. However, I still feel the gatekeepers are the same people. I still feel they're still holding those doors closed. I know that sounds cynical and bitter, but I do feel that.
I think
because
these are fights that have to be fought over and over again.
They do. They really do. You can never take it for granted, because it can so easily go back, as we see in the world, in politics and people with power, and the grab for power and how it manifests, and various groups who come up, and you're not in that group, so you're still an outsider. You're not ticking those boxes still. But, I mean, if I think about the things I've done and the people I've worked with, and I know people who are extraordinary artists who had to leave, and we lost them. I can name one, Barry Kosky.
Yes.
The great Barry Kosky.
Yeah.
So now the world owns Barry Kosky, not Australia, because when he was making his work, people were throwing their arms up. Oh, my God, what is he doing to opera? What is he doing to theatre?
And now he's a virtual institution, and if he's still based in Berlin, if he's still in
He
Germany.
is.
Yeah.
He's based in Berlin. Now, I remember those concerns, and I remember saying to people, oh, so you mean there's not enough other work as in I call mediocre work. You mean there's not enough of that work? So Barry Kosky's presence troubles you in Australia? Really?
Yes, and when they go, then after a little while they're forgotten by many, which is not a good thing. I mean,
unless you actively search. I mean, most young people now wouldn't know that the idea of going to see a Barry Kosky work at Sydney Theatre Company or Belvoir or the Old Fitz or Griffin. I mean, there are other writers and other directors and great young people now forging, but I still see them struggling in the same way. I still see the gatekeepers holding the doors closed to them. The good news is they are making great work. They're doing it independently. That's something I relate to, because when I came up in my 20s was when I realised that I kept doing it though. I kept doing it. I made the decision to be involved, to do it, which is perform. However I do it, I will do it. And that's the thing, I think.
I think a lot of people who are not artists and creators like yourself, they don't realise just how much bravery and tenacity as well as creativity is needed. And you putting yourself out there, especially, as you say, when you're young, from a migrant family, from an othered kind of family. It's brave work that you are doing in a totally different way, going to some of the places that you go to, Margo, in your fiction, which are informed by caring about society and, concerns about patriarchy and racism and I mean, I know you guys don't feel brave, but it is...
I don't feel as brave sitting on the train writing Black Juice as I think Paul is stepping out into the stage or making his own performances.
I think all creativity, the act itself requires so much energy and you give up so much. When I think about, even the things I did and having to, say, work in Melbourne for 3 months and my grandmother was alive, and I think, because of my relationship with her and how involved I was in her life, those things were very difficult. The other stuff about, your gender or your race and those things, that's a whole other thing. But I think what is required to make work, to sit, I don't know your process. I don't know how people write. I did a play once, but I was very much pushed by the director. Julian Merrick had the idea for me to write a play about my grandmother. And I had a lot of resistance because for me it was too raw, too emotional. And then the performing of it, having to talk about something so private, coming from a very private family, then the dedication to making the work. It's not easy. It's dedication, persistence.
And you're glad you did it?
Very glad. Very glad. I think of all my performing history, I would say that's probably the thing I am the most proud of. And the thing that
What was the title of that work?
It was called Angela's Kitchen.
Angela's Kitchen, of course.
And it's the one thing people do ask me to this day, will I ever do it again? We did 2 seasons at the Griffin. We toured Australia. The last time I performed it was in 2017 in Malta. And I was so emotional. So the further away from my grandmother's passing, she died in 2007, and I did it in 2017. And it was worse for me to do it. In fact, it was more difficult because I miss my grandmother more and more. And then to do it in her country, her story. She would never believe, But the thing of, writing and creating, I think it's incredible.
It's a mystery. Well, that makes it sound a little bit cliched, but there are very many mysterious processes that we go through, which I guess we've been talking about today. Thank you, Margo, and thank you, Paul. It has been such a pleasure and an honour to talk to two people who I've admired from afar for so long.
Thank you,
For
Jane.
year after year.
Thanks, Jane.
To now be in a studio with you.
It's a thrill.
It is a thrill.
Honestly, yeah.
Thank you very much.
The whole experience has been really good.
I'm very glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You've been listening to an episode of In the Saloon with. Your host has been Jane Messer, recording by Martin Gallagher, along with sound design. A big thanks to the whole Story Saloon team.